America isn't in a recession, it's in a survival phase. In the richest economy on earth, children go to school hungry, seniors choose between heat and food, and full-time workers can't afford groceries. Birth rates are collapsing, not because people don't want families, but because survival has replaced stability. Wages are frozen, prices are not. The safety net is fraying in real time. And while headlines say the economy is strong, everyday life is telling a very different story. This isn't about bad choices or individual failure. This is what happens when the cost of living breaks faster than society is willing to admit. Food insecurity is always the first signal that an economy has crossed from stress into breakdown, not unemployment, not markets, hunger. When people cannot reliably afford food, every other economic promise becomes meaningless. In the United States, over 42 million people rely on food assistance, including millions of children and seniors. That number is rising even as GDP and stock indexes hit record highs. This is not a paradox. It is proof that economic growth has fully disconnected from lived reality. Food prices have increased 25 to 30% since 2020, while wages, adjusted for inflation, have barely moved. For low-income households, groceries now consume 18 to 22% of total income, up from roughly 10% a decade ago. That shift alone is enough to collapse financial stability. The crisis is not driven by scarcity. America produces more than enough food. The failure is access, and access is governed by price. Staples that once absorbed small budget fluctuations now function like fixed bills. Formula exceeding $50 per can, eggs doubling, vegetables priced like luxury items? These are not isolated spikes. They reflect a food system built around financialized supply chains, pricing power, and margin protection, not affordability. When food becomes unaffordable, behavior changes immediately. Households stop buying protein, they downgrade nutrition, they skip meals. Parents eat less so children can eat more. Seniors stretch calories across days. This isn't temporary belt-tightening, chakko. It is a structural response to sustained pressure. Over time, these decisions cascade into health deterioration, higher medical costs, and reduced work capacity, feeding back into the same affordability trap. Food assistance was designed to absorb shocks like this. Instead, it is shrinking. Benefit calculations are tied to outdated inflation measures that ignore real grocery costs. Eligibility thresholds punish slight income increases, trapping people between earning more and eating less. Nearly 70% of households receiving food assistance include someone who works, and more than half are actively employed while receiving help. This is not dependency, it is wage failure. Cutting or suspending food assistance does not reduce costs, it moves them. Hunger doesn't disappear when benefits do. It shows up as emergency healthcare, classroom failure, homelessness, and long-term productivity loss. Every dollar removed from food, access multiplies into future public expense. Economically, it is irrational. Socially, it is destructive. Food insecurity also erodes something less visible but more dangerous: trust. When a society cannot guarantee basic nourishment, faith in institutions collapses. People stop believing effort leads to security. That psychological shift matters because once survival replaces expectation, spending falls, risk-taking disappears, and the broader economy slows from the inside out. Food insecurity doesn't appear in isolation. It is the downstream result of a more fundamental collapse. Work no longer converts into survival. The equation that once anchored modern life, effort equals stability, has broken, and food is simply the first bill that exposes it. In real terms, wages have been largely flat for decades. Adjusted for inflation, the median hourly wage has barely moved since the early 1970s, while the cost of housing, healthcare, insurance, transportation, and food has compounded relentlessly. Since 2020 alone, shelter costs are up roughly 35 to 40%, health insurance premiums 20 to 25%, auto insurance over 30%, and groceries nearly 30%. Yet nominal wage growth has averaged closer to 4%, most of which is consumed immediately by higher prices. The result is not poverty caused by unemployment, but poverty caused by employment that no longer pays enough. This breakdown is most visible when earnings are converted into time. At $15 an hour, a full-time worker earns about $31,200 a year before taxes. At $30 an hour, income rises to roughly $62,400. On paper, those figures appear respectable. In practice, they collapse under modern expense structures. After taxes, $30 an hour yields about $4,800 per month. Median rent in many metro areas now exceeds $1,500. Transportation routinely costs $700 to $900 monthly when factoring loans, insurance, fuel, and maintenance. Health coverage, utilities, food, and communications easily consume another $1,200 to $1,500. Before discretionary spending, savings, or emergencies, the margin is already gone. This is why working more hours no longer fixes the problem. Overtime is absorbed by inflation. Side jobs plug gaps temporarily, but increase exhaustion and reduce long-term earning capacity. Gig work, once framed as flexibility, now functions as wage volatility with no benefits. Tips fluctuate. Hours vanish without notice. Income becomes unpredictable while costs remain fixed. Stability requires predictability, and predictability has been stripped from the labor market. At the same time, the hiring system itself has changed. Job postings have exploded, but callbacks have not. Algorithmic screening, automated rejection, and credential inflation have reduced effective hiring rates to historic lows. A labor market can appear tight in aggregate data while remaining inaccessible at the individual level. Employment exists, but it is increasingly fragmented, temporary, or insufficient to support adult life. This is the critical link back to food insecurity. When work fails to cover essentials, households don't stop working. They start sacrificing. Nutrition is downgraded. Preventive healthcare is delayed. Debt replaces income. The economy continues to function statistically, but only by converting workers into shock absorbers. Once labor stops guaranteeing survival, stress becomes permanent. Permanent stress erodes health, decision-making, and productivity. That erosion does not stay contained within the workplace. It spreads into families, communities, and eventually the entire economy. When effort no longer produces security, the system loses its most important fuel: belief that participation is worth it. When work no longer guarantees survival, the damage does not stop at the bank account. It moves inward. What begins as an economic failure quickly becomes a biological and psychological one. This is where the crisis stops being abstract and starts reshaping the human body and brain. Chronic financial stress is not the same as short-term hardship. Short stress triggers action. Long stress rewires systems. Research shows sustained financial pressure activates the body's threat response continuously, flooding it with cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this suppresses immune function, disrupts sleep, raises blood pressure, and accelerates chronic illness. The body begins operating in survival mode, not recovery mode. That shift alone increases long-term healthcare costs by thousands of dollars per person each year, costs that low-income households cannot absorb. The brain pays an even steeper price. Studies from Princeton and Harvard demonstrate that persistent financial insecurity imposes a cognitive tax equivalent to losing roughly 10 to 15 IQ points. This is not metaphorical. MRI scans show reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, impulse control, and long-term decision-making. When every dollar must be calculated, the brain reallocates resources away from future thinking and toward immediate threat management. Survival math crowds out everything else. This explains why poverty is so often mischaracterized as poor decision-making. The decisions are not irrational. They are constrained. When resources are scarce, the mind narrows. Long-term optimization becomes impossible. Choices that appear short-sighted from the outside are often the only options available inside a stress system. This is not a moral failing. It is a physiological response to prolonged instability. The psychological consequences compound quickly. Financial insecurity is strongly correlated with anxiety disorders, depression, and burnout. The CDC estimates that adults under sustained economic stress are twice as likely to experience serious mental distress. Mental health care, however, remains largely inaccessible, with average therapy costs ranging from $100 to $250 per session, often uncovered by insurance. The result is untreated stress feeding untreated illness, feeding further instability. This is where the crisis loops back to productivity. A workforce operating under cognitive and emotional depletion cannot perform at full capacity. Absenteeism rises, errors increase, job turnover accelerates. Employers interpret this as individual weakness, but it is systemic fatigue. The economy loses output not because people won't work, but because their capacity to function is being biologically eroded. These effects also spill into families. Chronic stress reduces parental bandwidth, increases conflict, and impairs childhood development. Children raised in financially insecure households show higher rates of anxiety and reduced academic performance, not because of lack of effort, but because stress environments shape developing brains. The cost of this damage is deferred, not eliminated. It resurfaces later as lower lifetime earnings, higher medical spending, and increased reliance on public systems. This is the unseen layer of the cost of living crisis. Prices do not just drain wallets, they drain nervous systems. When survival becomes permanent, people do not simply adapt, they deteriorate. And once an economy begins damaging its own human capacity, the effects no longer remain personal. They become structural, cumulative, and increasingly irreversible. The biological and psychological damage of permanent financial stress does not end with working-age adults. It intensifies when income becomes fixed and prices remain fluid. This is where the system fails most clearly. Old age was supposed to be the safe zone. Instead, it has become the most fragile point of all. The average Social Security benefit is roughly $1,800 per month, or about $21,600 per year. That figure assumes stability in housing, utilities, healthcare, and food, an assumption that no longer holds. Since 2020, rent has risen 30 to 50% in many regions. Electricity and heating costs 20 to 35%, groceries nearly 30%, and healthcare expenses for seniors 7 to 8% annually, far above official inflation. Fixed income meets compounding costs, and the math breaks instantly. Housing alone exposes the crisis. Seniors who rent face increases that outpace cost of living adjustments. Those who own are not protected either. Property taxes rise alongside home values, insurance premiums reset higher, and maintenance costs climb with inflation. A $300 to $400 monthly increase in housing-related costs equals $3,600 to $4,800 per year. Nearly a quarter of total Social Security income gone without any lifestyle change. Ownership becomes a liability, not a shield. Healthcare compounds the pressure. Even with Medicare, out-of-pocket costs for prescriptions, supplemental insurance, dental care, and uncovered procedures routinely exceed $350 to $500 per month. Utilities average $150 to $200, and basic food costs often reach $300 to $400 even with reduced consumption. When these numbers are added together, essential expenses regularly exceed $2,000 per month before accounting for emergencies. The gap is not small, it is structural. This is how the oldest moral dilemma resurfaces in a modern economy: heat or food, not as rhetoric, but as arithmetic. When income cannot stretch, seniors ration. They skip meals. They lower thermostats. They delay medical care. These choices reduce quality of life immediately and increase medical risk long-term, pushing costs into emergency systems that are far more expensive than prevention. The consequences are visible in homelessness data. Adults over 50 are now the fastest-growing segment of the unhoused population, with an increase of nearly 50% since 2017. Projections suggest they could represent 70% of the homeless population by 2030. This is not driven by addiction or personal failure. It is driven by affordability collapse meeting fixed income reality. Retirement savings offer little protection. The median household savings for those aged 55 to 64 sits near $185,000. At sustainable withdrawal rates, that produces roughly $7,000 to $8,000 per year. Not enough to offset rising rent, food, and healthcare costs. Longevity, once a blessing, becomes a financial threat when systems are not designed to support it. This collapse ties directly back to the earlier damage. A lifetime of work that no longer guaranteed survival evolves into a retirement that cannot guarantee dignity. When elders, the group society is supposed to protect most, are forced into survival calculations, the social contract is no longer strained. It is broken. And once that break becomes visible, trust erodes across every generation watching it happen. As the elderly are pushed into impossible trade-offs, the final defense is supposed to be the safety net. But what exists today is not a net. It is a narrow illusion of protection built on outdated assumptions about work, prices, and stability. It looks functional on paper while failing in practice. Food assistance reaches roughly 42 million Americans, yet its design reflects an economy that no longer exists. Benefit calculations are tied to inflation models that underweight housing, healthcare, and real grocery costs. As a result, assistance rises slowly while prices surge rapidly, shrinking real purchasing power each year. A household can technically receive support while still being unable to afford food for the entire month. Eligibility does not equal adequacy. The most persistent myth is that assistance replaces work. In reality, nearly 70% of households receiving food support include at least one working adult, and roughly 58% are employed while receiving benefits. This is not a failure of motivation. It is a failure of wages. When full-time employment cannot cover basic nutrition, assistance becomes a subsidy for low pay, not a lifestyle choice. The structure of the system actively punishes marginal progress. Income thresholds are rigid. A small raise can trigger benefit reductions larger than the raise itself, producing an effective marginal tax rate that exceeds 50 to 80% for low-income workers. Earning more can mean eating less. This creates a trap where stability is penalized and volatility is rewarded. The system claims to promote self-sufficiency while mathematically discouraging it. Timing worsens the damage. Benefits are distributed monthly, but prices fluctuate weekly. Food inflation does not pause at the end of the month. When assistance runs out early, households do not stop needing calories, they stop purchasing them. Hunger concentrates at predictable intervals, increasing emergency room visits, school absenteeism, and short-term borrowing. Each of these responses carries higher downstream costs than the assistance that was withheld. Cuts and suspensions amplify instability rather than resolving it. Removing food support does not eliminate hunger, it relocates expense. Every dollar cut from nutrition programs generates multiple dollars in healthcare, housing instability, and productivity loss later. Economically, this is not austerity, it is deferred liability. The safety net also assumes short-term disruption, not permanent pressure. It was designed to bridge temporary unemployment or crisis, not to support millions of working households trapped between stagnant wages and rising prices year after year. When temporary tools are stretched into permanent solutions, failure becomes inevitable. This illusion matters because it shapes public perception. As long as assistance exists, leaders can claim vulnerability is addressed. But when the net fails quietly, through insufficiency, bureaucracy, and erosion, the burden shifts back onto individuals already stretched to the limit. That shift accelerates everything described earlier: stress, cognitive overload, health decline, and instability. And once people realize the safety net cannot catch them, behavior changes, trust collapses, risk tolerance disappears, spending contracts. The economy does not break from the top down. It breaks when millions quietly conclude that the system designed to protect them no longer works, and stop believing that participation will ever lead to security. Once the safety net is exposed as insufficient, the assumption shifts to the middle class. The belief is simple: earning decent money should insulate people from crisis. But when the math is done honestly, that belief collapses. The problem is no longer income level. It is cost structure. At $30 an hour, annual pay reaches roughly $62,400. After federal, state, and payroll taxes, monthly take-home lands near $4,700 to $4,900. That number looks stable until it collides with modern fixed expenses. Median rent across large portions of the country now exceeds $1,500, and in many metros pushes $2,000. Transportation absorbs another $700 to $900 once insurance, fuel, and maintenance are included. Health insurance premiums and out-of-pocket costs routinely exceed $200 to $300 monthly. Utilities, internet, and phone services add $250 to $350. Food, even with restraint, reaches $400 to $500. Before savings, debt repayment, or discretionary spending, essential costs already approach $3,300 to $3,800. That leaves a margin too thin to absorb volatility. One car repair, one medical bill, one tax adjustment erases the buffer entirely. The average unexpected expense in the US is roughly $1,200, larger than what most middle-income households can absorb without borrowing. Debt fills the gap, but it is not relief. Credit cards now carry interest rates above 20 to 25%, turning short-term fixes into long-term drains. Student loans, auto loans, and buy now, pay later plans fragment income further, converting future earnings into present survival. The result is a household that appears stable externally, but is internally brittle. This fragility explains a key contradiction. Households earning more than ever report less security than past generations, earning far less. In the mid-1980s, housing consumed roughly 25% of income. Today, it often exceeds 35 to 40%. Healthcare has doubled as a share of household budgets. Insurance, once optional, has become mandatory. These are not lifestyle upgrades, they are structural costs. What makes this phase dangerous is perception. Middle-income households are expected to carry the system. They are taxed more, receive less assistance, and are assumed to be resilient. But when their math fails, the collapse accelerates. They cut spending sharply, not gradually. They stop taking risks. They delay life decisions. Demand contracts suddenly, not slowly. This links directly to what follows. When the middle class pulls back, it does not create inconvenience. It creates economic gravity. Consumption slows, hiring freezes, and pressure rolls downhill again. What looks like personal budgeting failure is actually the moment where affordability finally snaps. Not at the bottom, but in the middle. When middle-class math breaks, the impact does not stay contained at the household level. It moves outward into the economy itself. This is where personal affordability turns into systemic demand collapse, and the cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Consumer spending drives roughly 70% of US GDP. That engine only works when households believe tomorrow will be stable enough to justify spending today. Once that belief breaks, behavior shifts abruptly. Discretionary purchases disappear first, followed by delayed essentials, deferred maintenance, skipped healthcare, and reduced food quality. This is not caution. It is forced retrenchment. The danger is not just lower spending, but how fast it contracts. Households do not reduce consumption evenly. They cut entire categories at once. When millions of households simultaneously pull back, revenue falls across retail, services, housing turnover, travel, and local economies. Businesses respond predictably, hiring freezes, reduced hours, layoffs, and price increases to protect margins. Each response feeds back into the same affordability pressure that caused the pullback in the first place. Prices do not fall to meet demand the way theory suggests. Modern pricing is dominated by fixed costs, financial obligations, and shareholder expectations. Rent, insurance, utilities, healthcare, and debt servicing do not become cheaper when consumers struggle. They become stickier. When demand weakens, companies raise prices selectively, shrink product sizes, add fees, or cut quality to preserve revenue. The consumer experiences this as inflation continuing even as purchasing power collapses. This creates the feedback loop. Reduced spending leads to weaker job growth. Weaker job growth increases income insecurity. Insecurity further suppresses spending. Meanwhile, prices remain elevated because costs are locked in upstream. The economy slows, but the cost of living does not. This is the most dangerous phase because it feels like stagnation while quietly eroding capacity. Food and housing intensify the loop. When households downgrade nutrition to save money, health outcomes worsen, increasing medical costs and absenteeism. When housing turnover slows, construction, lending, and local tax bases weaken. Municipalities respond with higher fees and taxes, pushing costs back onto residents already under pressure. What begins as private belt-tightening becomes public strain. This is why demand collapse is not a recession headline. It is a behavioral shift. Once households stop believing that spending will improve their future, consumption stops functioning as an economic stabilizer. It becomes defensive. The final risk emerges here: confidence. Economies do not break when numbers turn negative. They break when expectations reset downward. Once people internalize that prices will remain high while incomes remain fragile, caution hardens into permanence. And when that happens, the pressure does not lift on its own. It deepens, pushing the system toward its final contradiction. Even ownership no longer guarantees safety. Once demand collapses and prices refuse to fall, the final damage is not economic. It is civic. This is where the system breaks its oldest promise. The social contract was simple: work, participate, contribute, and life becomes more stable over time. That promise is now reversing, and 2026 is where the reversal becomes undeniable. High prices are no longer a temporary shock. They are being locked in structurally. Housing costs remain elevated because supply cannot be rebuilt quickly, and financing costs stay high. Insurance premiums are resetting upward permanently as climate risk, medical inflation, and repair costs compound. Property taxes rise automatically with assessed values, functioning as an inflation ratchet. Even if headline inflation slows, the price level does not reset. It stabilizes at a higher plateau. This is why 2026 matters. By then, households will have absorbed multiple years of elevated costs without corresponding income growth. Real wages remain flat. Savings rates are already near historic lows. Credit is stretched. What was once temporary pressure becomes baseline reality. The cost of simply existing, housing, food, energy, healthcare, transportation, consumes a larger share of income every year regardless of effort. The system's response compounds the fracture. Governments continue collecting higher tax revenue driven by inflation, while households experience no real relief. Corporations protect margins through automation, price discipline, and workforce reduction. Assistance programs remain capped by outdated formulas. The burden is pushed downward and inward, onto individuals expected to adapt endlessly to conditions they cannot control. This is the moment the social contract snaps. People realize that following the rules no longer leads to security. Education does not guarantee opportunity. Full-time work does not guarantee stability. Home ownership does not guarantee protection. Retirement does not guarantee dignity. The finish line keeps moving, and always faster than people can run. When belief collapses, behavior changes permanently. Long-term planning disappears. Family formation slows. Mobility declines. Trust in institutions erodes. Participation becomes transactional rather than hopeful. This is not rebellion. It is withdrawal. And withdrawal is devastating for a system that depends on confidence more than compliance. The most dangerous part is that this collapse does not announce itself with a single event. It unfolds quietly through millions of private calculations made every month. What to delay, what to skip, what to give up. By the time it becomes visible in the data, it is already embedded in daily life. This is the end state of a cost of living crisis left uncorrected. Not chaos, resignation. Not panic, exhaustion. And once a society accepts survival as the ceiling instead of the floor, the damage is no longer reversible by optimism, politics, or promises.